Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today's video is going to be discussing my updated Necromancer build with everything I've learned over the last 2 seasons, talking about some options to change the build up and what I've done to craft the build to this point. I've so far gotten it so this build solo will be able to hit over 500 million damage to bosses, and I think it's unbelievably strong. I wanted to make this video after the patch to ensure that nothing changed that I was going to talk about here, so let's dive right into it.
87 million I just did. 228 million.
But before we dive into the build, we need to discuss today's sponsor. Let me introduce you to Bloodlines Heroes of Lilith. This game takes RPGs and gacha gameplay to a whole new level with their air system. You can create your own unique legendary champions by combining the bloodlines of elves, demons, demigods, orcs, dwarves, lycans, dragonborn, vampires, and so on. And yes, the game is free to play. Download it now using the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen if you're viewing it on a PC to unlock an incredible starter pack worth around $20. This game is designed with stunning graphics to provide a top-tier visual experience on mobile phones and smart pads. Enjoy collecting fantasy characters in fully fleshed out 3D graphics. Customize your champions by marrying any 2 bloodlines to create over 1,000 fantasy hybrids and endless possibilities for your lineups and matchmaking strategies. The hybrids inherit not only the talents and traits of their parents, but also their unique appearances passed down from each family tree infused into one. New bloodlines with unique abilities and companion forms for each gender are released every 2 weeks, so the fun of creating new hybrid combinations never ends. All players can obtain uniquely designed hybrid champions, Bloodcraft Legends, by earning points in seasonal guild wars. In this game, you can switch the genders of your companions freely and raise heirs with them, build your kingdom and economy with strategic gameplay, and enjoy beautiful scenes and interesting storylines. Download the game now for free on both Android and iOS, either using the link in the description down below or scanning this QR code if you're on PC. If you use the link in the description or the QR code, you get access to a special starter pack. This pack includes 1 summoning crystal, 100,000 gold, and 100 diamonds, which is a $20 pack in-game. The first 30 players who leave their in-game account ID and username replying to the pinned comment down below will receive a free female legendary orc companion, Ugrel, one of the best warriors to carry you through the game. Alright, so let's dive into the build. I'm not going to spend too much time on the skill tree because it's pretty simple. You're not going to use any of your basic abilities, and honestly, you're not even going to slot your core ability on your skill bar, but you do want to ensure that you have the 3rd tier of Blighted on Supernatural Blight, because this allows you and your minions to do 15% increased damage to enemies affected by Blight across the board, as long as there's Blight on the ground, and we get that Blight from our Bone Prison. The passive node, we want to select is Hewed Flesh because there's a 12% chance for corpses to spawn under the target location, and that is very important for fortification, and also the more corpses on the ground, the more opportunity you have to do things like exploding the corpses, corpse tendrils, etc. For our Corpse and Macabre skills, you're going to actually want to put some points into Corpse Explosion. So we're going to choose to do the Blighted Corpse Explosion, which allows for DOT type ticks on the ground, shadow damage on the ground. But I do like using Blood Mist, and the Blood Mist that leaves behind corpses allows you to automatically explode said corpses while you're in Blood Mist. So you are constantly creating corpse miasmas from your corpse explosions while you're using the Blood Mist. You want to buff up the skeletal masteries just because you want to increase their health. The skeletal mage damage and skeletal warrior damage doesn't really matter too much in this build, as there's no real viable way to do insane damage without using Ring of Mindel. So honestly, the main reason we're putting points into these masteries is to increase their health. We want to put points into Bone Prison, specifically the one that allows enemies inside a Bone Prison to be vulnerable, and we'll be reaching for an aspect to make sure there's Blight inside of the Bone Prison as well. We're going to put 1 point into Grim Harvest, but that's mostly just so we can get to Fueled by Death, which allows us to do 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse, which we will be doing all the time. Moving down, I put 1 point into Death's Embrace because I had an additional point, but the main thing you want to buff up here is Amplify Damage. You want to have 3 points in there, and I luckily got another 3 points from my necklace, which allows me to do 24% increased damage to enemies that are cursed, which is super strong. You want points in Decrepify, and this is probably the best ability in all of the Necromancer's kit, simply because of this abhorrent Decrepify. There is a 15% chance to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second whenever an enemy is hit while having Decrepify on them. This skyrockets your cooldown straight down, so you're able to use your abilities as soon as you possibly can. Similar story here from Skeletal Mage Mastery, just to increase the mage's health. We want Corpse Tendrils, another source of vulnerability, and also it locates all the enemies into one location, but there's also an aspect that allows us to do increased critical strike damage and percentage of chance of critical strike upon using Corpse Tendrils. Necrotic Carapace allows us to fortify every time a corpse is created. Reaper's Pursuit allows us to do increased movement speed when enemies are affected by darkness skills. This is important because Necromancer movement speed is very important, and any piece that you can get it on, you're typically looking for because they don't have a lot of mobility. But the main thing we want on this final tree is Bone Storm, specifically due to the fact that it'll also generate a barrier for us 24/7 and allow us to do 20% increased critical strike chance while it's active. Last but not least, we want the Shadow Blight key passive, but we will talk about why when we get into the gear aspects. So now let's quickly get into the Book of the Dead for our warriors. We're going to go with Reapers and the Reaper option that allows a 15% chance for them to spawn a corpse on the ground. This is incredibly strong for generating Fortify for yourself, but also just the fact that you have more corpses on the ground allows you to explode more corpses, to use corpse tendrils, and to heal your minions whenever you see fit. Very, very strong. I highly suggest you use Reapers and don't vary off them at all. When it comes to the Shadow Mages, there's a little bit of variability here because we do have that passive that allows our shadow damage to stun, generating more stun opportunity, but inherently on the Shadow Mages, there is a 10% chance to stun as well. So I like to double down and add the 10% chance from this and from the ability in our passive node on the Shadow Tree to also Crippling Darkness have a chance to stun enemies as well. For our Golem, we're going to sacrifice to allow for 30% increased critical strike damage. The only time I'd see switching off this is if you're running Nightmares where you don't need to be hitting 500 million to get through the dungeons. Instead, you have a Bone Golem, which is going to be able to taunt enemies to keep everything and aggro off your face. So let's dive into the gear, but I mostly just want to talk about aspects as when it comes to gear and min-maxing. Yes, you could find better pieces 24/7 and always. It's the whole point of this end game is to chase perfect gear. So I do highlight a bit of what you might be looking for on the build down below, but I would listen into the aspects so you understand why we're doing what we're doing. In the helmet, we have 2 additional skeletal warriors for our aspect, and that is very strong just to add additional procs and men down and big hits of damage. We're doing the same concept here on our chest piece, and yes, this chest piece is awesome. It's got physical damage, total armor, and damage. Obviously, I'd rather swap out damage reduction than armor, and I'd want to move around that control impaired duration. But no matter what, I have damage and physical damage helps increase the damage of Mendel, which is super strong. On our gloves, we are having the Bone Prison spawns a Pool of Blight, and this is very strong simply due to the fact that the Pool of Blight adds that 15% increased damage to anybody inside of it. So when we put that Bone Prison around somebody, we will be proccing 15% increased damage to them no matter what. On our legs, we have the Bone Storm, gives you a 5% barrier per hit. So this is just the tankiness of this build. You constantly want to run this as much as you can. It also, with Bone Storm, obviously increases your critical strike chance, etc. On our boots, I have Blood Mist, triggers Corpse Explosion. This actually allows you to get rid of Corpse Explosion on the skill bar. You know, say you wanted to slot in Golem if you're doing Nightmares, that is absolutely viable. But when it comes to Uber Lilith, I find it more impactful to have Corpse Explosion. On the wand, I have deal 9.5% increased damage while you stand still. Things like damage while close, vulnerable damage, and critical strike damage on a wand. Gotta be a strong wand, right? Like stuff like that is what you're pretty much looking for, and any chance you can find that. On the necklace, I have amplified damage with 3 ranks, which is unbelievably strong. The the lucky hit chance while barrier is important too, but the rest of the stats are absolutely useless. But on the aspect side of things, we have the Corpse Tendril aspect, which increases our critical strike chance and critical strike damage to enemies after Corpse Tendrils. Unbelievably necessary for your amulet. I would highly suggest you put this on your amulet. I do have an unbelievable amulet here that I wish I could put on, but it just does not work with the Malignant Hearts right now until I figure something out in the future. But you can see this damage right here, damage reduction while shadow affected, and amplified damage. This is one of the most perfect necklaces, and I haven't rolled a single thing, so I can get rid of those corpse skills as well. This is an unbelievable necklace. I wish I could slot this into the build right now, but I don't have that. Ring them in down, the crux of the entire build. You want to try to find something that has awesome physical damage on the proc. This is actually 16,149 for the physical damage proc on Ring 'em and Down as its base stat number. Then you get into the damage while you have a barrier active. Since you'll constantly have a barrier from your Bone Storm, this is really strong as well. Another up to 25% chance for barrier damage, or for damage while barrier is active. And then lastly, we have the increased damage by 106% for 6 seconds after your Shadow Blight key passive damages an enemy 10 times. So once you get all that shadow damage procs to hit enough enemies, you will instinctively be doing overall 106% increased damage. absolutely necessary, and it's the main reason why we're putting that Shadow Blight key passive at the bottom of our abilities. So now let's get into the hearts that we use and why. First heart you're going to use is the Vicious Heart that allows you to do increased damage with your critical strike damage and reduce damage outside of critical strike. Since we have a lot of aspects that boost our critical strike chance, this heart is a must because we will have up to an 80% increase in critical strike damage, which almost happens almost every time we're using those Corpse Tendrils and Bone Prison combo, which procs our men down. It's super strong. I highly recommend this alongside almost every single person in this season is using right now. The Barber Heart. The Barber Heart is very strong. It allows us to do 56% increased damage over 4 seconds while it accumulates all that damage. Super good to have right now. It procs it all at once. Big damage numbers. It's fun to use. And then lastly, I'm using the Decrepify Heart, which allows, when 0 enemies around, I'm constantly casting Decrepify on everyone around me. You can replace this with the Utilize of Corpse Heart if you see fit, whether you're bouncing between Nightmares and bossing. Specifically on Lilith, I like the Decrepify Heart, but I could see in Nightmares wanting to use the Corpse Usage Heart, which, constantly explodes corpses with Corpse Tendrils and Corpse Explosion around you as you're walking around. Granted, I would be doing insane damage even without these hearts, just simply due to the nature of how this build works with everything synergizing, but with this specific heart combo, I'm able to hit over 500 million damage for damage ticks, which is unbelievably insane. So let's quickly talk about the skill rotation because people ask me this all the time and I think it'd be more impactful for me just to talk about it. So what I typically like to do is stay as stationary as possible while using Bone Storm to generate barrier for myself, increasing my damages on both of those fronts, using Corpse Tendrils to not only proc that Corpse Tendril aspect, put everyone in location, drop a Bone Prison around them to ensure that I get the Ring 'em in down proc and proc the lucky hits. And with all of that synergizing, the Barber Heart will proc, and the more times you're able to get the lucky hit proc off, the more Bone Prisons you can drop. If it's off cooldown, the better before the heart proc drops, and you're able to hit hundreds of millions of damage. Obviously, your Blood Mist is a really great tool to stay completely stationary without taking any damage should you need to, or to get out of oh shit situations. And then your Corpse Explosion, or depending on if you're going to be using Golem, you might want Golem there to taunt. Corpse Explosion is just to blow up your extra corpses in the meantime. And that is the most of the build. Obviously, you're going to be wanting to raise skeletons to bring up the Skeletal Priests whenever you're maxed on your fully maxed out minions. It'll heal them and provide a little damage buff for them as well. So now let's get into the Paragon tree. I'm mostly going to be discussing the glyphs that I'm using, as there is some opportunity to change this up slightly. I do think I have it pretty much min-maxed to how I would want it at the moment. So for the first glyph socket, I choose Amplify simply because it's going to buff up our damage and armor from these different nodes right here. We choose to next go with the Flesh Eater tree. Head up this left side because you do get damage to injured enemies and critical strike damage, which is important. But also on the glyph here, we're going to choose damage to enemies while are close. If I had more Paragon points, I would likely go snag these 2 additional dexterity nodes. Heading over, we go next into the Scent of Death tree, where we're going to be using the damage while healthy or Imbibber glyph, Imbibber glyph, where it's going to be damage that you do while you're healthy. And since we're going to be fortified and barriered so much on this build, it's very important to use that as well. I snag these armor points as you get through. You're going to get more critical strike damage up here and 3 additional nodes of critical strike. And then heading up next, we go into the Bloodbath tree, but we're actually obviously not going to be snagging that passive. Instead, it's going to be a way for us to transverse into an immediate glyph socket, which we're going to add critical strike damage, and you're going to snag as many dexterity points as you possibly can here. Moving forward, also touching the damage while fortified, which is pretty much consistently always going to be fortified on this build, so it's very strong, and touching additional critical strike damage nodes. I would think about heading up here and adding additional damage while healthy once I get more nodes, but for now I had to move forward because we needed a little bit of tankiness on our minions. We're going to go into next the Cult Leader tree, but not even snagging that point because honestly minion damage is not that important for a Ring 'em in down build, and instead we are going to be grabbing these damage reduction nodes and slapping on the vulnerable damage buff right here. Honestly, I choose to use the vulnerable damage on this glyph because vulnerable damage recently got a nerf, so I don't see it as being as prioritized in my mind of what I need to do to buff it up. Up lastly to the Wither tree, just to snag these damage while affected by shadow damage over time. And also these nodes there's a lot of damage to elites, which does matter on bosses, so I see this being very useful against Lilith. More points allows for a lot of opportunity. Like I said, you can reach out to get more damage while fortified, damage while healthy, etc. More nodes of damage affected by shadow over time, that kind of stuff, and buffing up a little bit more of these glyphs is what I do with my additional points. But right now I don't have them. I only have 2 out of the 5 map completions done, so as you can see, I would have plenty more points if I wanted to run through those. But honestly, I just wanted to show that it's viable to take Lilith out with this build at a relatively low level in the low 90s with not maxed out Paragon points to show that it's possible. Comments, watch time, thumbs up, coming over to Twitch and hitting the follow button. button and hitting the subscribe button down below are the best ways to support me. All that stuff is more appreciated than you would ever know. Thank you so much for being here today, and I'll see you in a video soon.